Well, good evening, Key City Church. It is so good to be here with you guys this evening. If you're here for the first time, we're so happy to have you joining us, and we just invite you to relax and make yourself at home. If there's anything that you need or have any questions or need help finding something, please feel free to stop anybody who has one of the name tag lanyards on. They'd be more than happy to help you out. In case you noticed, we had some elementary age kids singing with us during the music in the back, and that's our KC Kids group who comes in during the music portion. If you have kids that are nursery age through elementary age and you'd be interested in finding out more about the KC Kids program, then I'd encourage you to just follow the hallway around, and there's an amazing team of leaders who would be happy to show you around or answer any questions that you might have. Close to you on the chairs, there should be a card called our KC Connect card. If you're interested in keeping up with us and staying in touch with us and knowing about what's going on here, we promise we're not going to spam you, but if you do want to stay in touch, we'd love to stay in touch with you. And if you want to give us your contact information so that we can maintain that contact and drop it off at the table out in the lobby, we will trade you a t-shirt for that card. And if you feel are interested in getting connected here, we're a brand new church. This is our 5th week meeting together, and we know how important it is to get connected. If you would like to get connected, whatever that might look like for you, whatever feels comfortable to you, there are a list of options on the back of that card so that you can let us know how you would like to get connected so that we can make sure to help you take whatever step feels comfortable for you. And again, you can drop that card off at the table out in the lobby. Well, this week is week 4 of our 6-week conversation that we've been having about faith and freedom, a conversation we call Faith for Freedom, because for so many of us, the faith that you grew up in, the faith that you were introduced to, or the version of faith maybe that you eventually walked away from was a version of faith where you had to trade in some level of freedom in order to align with that faith. It was a version of faith where the idea of faith and freedom tended to be antagonistic, where you could have one or the other, but you never really felt like you could have both of them. To align with that version of faith, you had to be willing to trade in some of your freedom, and likewise, if you wanted to experience some freedom, you had to violate or go against some aspect of that faith. And if you're just joining us here tonight for the first time, you're kind of walking in the middle of that conversation, which is completely fine. But we'd encourage you to go back and check out the previous 3 weeks so that you can get caught up and understand how we've arrived at where we are today. But don't worry, we're going to catch you up and get you read in so you know where we're going from here. Because one of the things that we've talked about so far, one of the things that we've recognized is that what we do exists on a spectrum, and that what we don't do freely, we do by control. That everything that we do, our responses, our actions, our choices, exist on a spectrum. And on one side of the spectrum, we function freely. We do things because we freely choose to do them. They align with our beliefs, they align with our values, they align with what we want, and we do them because we freely choose them. And on the other end of the spectrum are things that we do by control. And control is the way you get someone to do what they won't freely choose. And we know this. We've experienced this. That control is finding the right threat or the right punishment or the right reward in order to override someone's free choice, to get them to do what they wouldn't freely choose. And everything that we do exists somewhere on the spectrum. Completely free, completely controlled, or sometimes even a little bit of a mix of both. And what we've recognized is that the things that we do freely, we do fiercely. Like what we do freely, we do fiercely. We work harder, we work longer, we enjoy it. We're more creative when we're doing the things that we do freely. And we usually get better outcomes, and we enjoy it, even when it's hard stuff. But the things that we do by control, the problem with control is that control always, always, always comes with a cost. What we do freely, we do fiercely, but control always comes with a cost. That control, when we're functioning by control, it always incites fear, fear of punishment, fear of threat, fear of missing out on the reward. It's always fear-driven. And what we know about fear is that fear always, always undermines trust. And for a lot of us, or maybe for some of us, the faith that you grew up in or the version of faith that you inherited was a control-based version of faith that believed in a control-based version of God. A God who established standards for what you had to believe and how you had to behave. And because what God was expecting people to do was something that no one would freely choose, God instituted punishments and rewards to get people to do those things that they wouldn't freely choose. And on top of that, God's acceptance, his approval became contingent on believing and behaving the way that God wanted you to. So if you do what God says to do, he'll be pleased with you. But if you don't, well, then he won't. And behind every control-based version of God, you tend to find a control-based community where in order to belong, you have to believe and behave. And if you believe and you behave the way that they want you to, well, then they'll accept you and be pleased with you. But if you don't, well then they won't. And it's control-based. And for a lot of us, it's why we resisted that version of faith. It's why we never wanted to walk into a church in the first place. For some of us, we didn't resist. We kind of aligned with it. And it was fine for a time because it did keep us in line. It was a point in our lives where we needed some structure, something to bring us into alignment. It was a good place to begin because it reined in the sin. But eventually, that control, as you resigned yourself to that control, eventually you started to resent it. You started to resent the fact that you couldn't function outside of these narrow margins that had been drawn for you. And eventually, if you continued that resignation, it led to a sense of disintegration, that feeling where you haven't just lost your freedom, but you feel like you've lost a part of yourself. And for some people, for some of us maybe, it's why we walked out. It's why we walked away. And who could blame you, really? But the good news, if that was you or if that is you, the good news is that version of faith was the same version of faith that Jesus was inviting his first century followers out of. In fact, what we've discovered is that Jesus, that God, the God who created us, and I wasn't ready for that. I didn't realize that was next. But it's my fault. The God who created us to be like him, who created us in his image to be like him and watched us lose sight of what he was like and become very unlike him, that God became like us in the person of Jesus to show us exactly what he's like. And his first century eyewitnesses concluded that if Jesus is what God is like, then God is love, an unconditional, self-sacrificial, my best for your best kind of love. And not only did God come to show us exactly what he's like in the person of Jesus, but he invited us to follow him, not to follow a set of rules, but to follow him, that we would become like him. Created like the God whose image we were created in, to become like God, to become people who leverage their best for the best of others. And it wasn't an invitation to align with rules, it was an invitation to align with reality, the reality of how life works. The only way life can work is in alignment with God's way of love and to align with who you were and I was ultimately created to be. People who love others with a self-sacrificial, unconditional love. And what we also recognize is that if you want someone to align with rules, the best way to do that is through control. The best way to do that is through fear, punishment, and reward. But if you want someone to align with reality, the best way to do that, the currency that we use to get people to align with reality, is trust. And trust can only ever be given freely. You can't coerce, you can't threaten, you can't force, you can't manipulate, you can't bribe someone to trust you. For trust to be trust, it has to be given freely because you're convinced of the other person's intentions. And that's exactly what Jesus came to accomplish on the cross. That through the cross, Jesus showed us that if he's willing to die for us, then he is for us. And that he will never violate our freedom. that he came, that we would trust him freely. And in trusting him freely, that we would be set free into who we were, who you were meant to be. Someone who looks and who loves, just like Jesus. And if the version of Christianity that you've been practicing doesn't feel like freedom, it might not be Jesus' version of Christianity. Because Jesus came to invite us in freely that we would be set free. And so last week we pivoted our conversation and we started asking this question. We asked, how do we get free? If Jesus came to set us free, how does this work? How do we get free? Because some of us feel a little bit nervous about this whole freedom concept because we're like, you don't mean like freedom, because, we can't be all the way free, right? And there's some of us who feel like, I bet we're going to go down a road where freedom's going to turn into not freedom, right? We're going to be trading in our freedom again. And we're all waiting to see where this goes. So how does this work? How do we actually get free? And what we started talking about were, for Key City Church, three things, three strategies, three points of living. We haven't figured out what to call them yet, but three things that we see Jesus repeat, that we see his eyewitnesses repeat in the letters and the books and the accounts that we find in the New Testament. Three things that we see repeated over and over again. Three things that we hear in stories of people who follow Jesus and experience freedom into their God-given potential, and three things that we tend to experience in our own lives. Like, if we boiled it all down to the three common denominators, these are the things that we tend to find repeated over and over again as the critical common denominators for setting people free. And you might have a different list. You might have your own three. You might have six. You might have five that you borrowed from another church or another pastor that you listen to, and that's fine. But these are the three that we're always going to come back to here. And the first one that we talked about last week is the recognition that what holds us back from experiencing the life that Jesus created to live. That Jesus didn't come to constrain us into something that we're not. He came to free us from what's holding us back into who we ultimately are. And what we found out last week is that what so often holds us back from being free and who we were meant to be is a limited perspective of reality. That Jesus came not to give us a list of beliefs for us to agree with, but Jesus came to turn the lights on for people living in the dark. Jesus came to give us a perspective, to help us to see the world, to see reality the way that he sees. That when we see as Jesus sees, loving like Jesus just comes naturally. That when we see God as he is, when we see others as they are, when we see ourselves as God sees us, when we see eternity the way that God sees it, that loving the way that Jesus loved just comes naturally. So the first one we talked about last week, number one, was a Christ-centered worldview, cultivating a Christ-centered worldview. This week, we're talking about the number two big thing. And we come across this number two big thing in a conversation that Jesus had, the conversation that we started last week. We're going to continue the conversation that we started last week. And it's a conversation where the Pharisees, who were the elite religious leaders of Judaism during that time, who led a control-based version of Judaism, where they saw themselves as the keepers of right belief, because so often in control-based versions of faith, you find elite leaders who've made themselves the keepers of right belief, and in order to be right with God, you have to be right by them. These were the Pharisees, and they overheard what Jesus was teaching and how Jesus was teaching, and so they'd gone to correct him, to correct Jesus. And so Jesus essentially explained to them what we just talked about. That, like, I love your idea that you're right and you have it all figured out, but I have come to help you see. And when you see, when you who think you have it all figured out, when you see as I see, you will be set free. Which we can imagine created a lot of tension with the Pharisees. Because essentially, Jesus was telling them that they were wrong and he was right. And he had drawn the line. And that is where we're going to pick up today. Because Jesus drew the line, and here are the Pharisees and how they respond. Here's what they say. They answered, "We are Abraham's descendants." We're Abraham's descendants. Abraham, who God had made the promise to some 2,500 years before, that God told Abraham, I'm going to make a nation out of you. Then Abraham had kids, and their kids had kids, and their kids had kids. And that became the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel. They're like, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. I mean, Jesus is saying that he's going to set them free. They're like, we've never been slaves. How can you say that we shall be set free? And they knew that Jesus wasn't talking about like actual slavery, like literal slavery, because, I mean, the Jewish nation had been like everybody's slaves through history. Like they'd been slaves of the Egyptians, of the Assyrians, of the Babylonians, of the Greeks, and now the Romans. Like slavery wasn't new to them. They knew he wasn't talking about actual slavery. They knew that he was talking about some kind of metaphysical, spiritual slavery, which was just preposterous to them, because they're the keepers of right belief. Like, how could we be slaves? And what Jesus says next, what he says next, he uses words that have established and picked up a lot of baggage over the last 2,000 years. That what Jesus says next, it's so easy for us to mishear because the words have accumulated so much baggage, and it's easy for us to be reactive. So we have to just pause here. We're going to pause here. We're going to unpack it a little bit so we can see it the way that Jesus sees it. Here's what Jesus says. He says, very truly, which literally is truly, truly. Like, this is double true. Like, not just true, double true, so listen up. Truly, truly, I tell you, everyone who sins, right? We have a feeling about that sin word. We have beliefs, we have pictures in our mind that come up when we hear sin. Like when we hear everyone who sins, what we hear is everyone who breaks the rules, and now God's not happy with you. What comes to mind is a God who made rules to be followed and people to follow them. And our job is to learn the rules and do the rules. And if you do what God says to do, then he'll be happy with you. And we don't know why the rules are the rules. We don't always understand the rules. And sometimes they just seem kind of like arbitrary and made up. But God's like, he's old-fashioned and he's religious, and you just have to do them. And as long as you learn to follow the rules and keep the rules, then you can keep God happy. That's what we tend to think. When Jesus said sin, the Greek word is the word hamartia, which just means to wander from the path. It was just wandering from the path. And his first century hearers, like, they understood path, like we understand path. A path is how you get to where you're trying to go, right? A path is what you use to get to the place that you want to go. And the reason that the path is there is because it will get you to where you want to go, and it makes it easier to get to where you want to go. Like, and when you get off the path, we understand this. When you walk off the path, not only do you not get to where you want to go, you get hurt along the way. Like, they put in paths because they're like rocks and trees and sticks and stumps and all kinds of stuff you can stumble over and get hurt on. The reason the path is there is it makes it easier. It is easier to walk on a path. And ultimately, the path gets you to where you want to go. We understand path. Path is clear. We get this. Sin, Jesus said, sin is when you wander off the path. What's the path? What is the path? The path is what God came to show us in the person of Jesus. It's God's way of love. That is the path that Jesus is inviting us to follow him down. It's the way of love. And it's what gets us to where we all ultimately want to go. It's what establishes the world that we all want to see exist. All of the hurt, all of the heartbreak, all of the trauma, all of the violence, all of the struggle that happens between people and people, all of it is fixed with love one another as I have loved you, love. All of it is fixed with love your neighbor as yourself. All of it is fixed is your best for the best of others living. All of it. Love is the way to where we all want to go. It's what creates the world that we all want to live in. And it's what produces who we all truly want to be. People who experience the release of their potential to leverage their best for the best of others. That's love. It produces who we truly want to be, and it produces the world that we ultimately want to live in. That's the path. And when we walk off of that path, when we veer off of that path, it undermines our best and it undermines the best of others. When we walk off of the path, it does not lead to where we all want to go. And we get hurt along the way. And you get hurt along the way. And other people get hurt along the way. The reason that sin is because it hurts you and it hurts other people. The reason that God says don't do that is because the cost that it has to you and the cost that it has to the who sitting next to you and the who sitting right across from you. That the reason that God calls sin isn't because of what it does to him. God's fine. He created the universe. He's good to go. He's fine. What bothers him about sin is not what it does to him. It's about what it does to you and the who right next to you and the who sitting right across from you. So Jesus says, sin, anyone who sins, everyone who sins, everybody who wanders off the path, well, as a slave to sin. To which we're like, whoa, that's slave to sin? Like, that's a little harsh, Jesus. I mean, yes, little irritable with my wife this week. Yes, guilty. Lost my temper with the kids. Sure, yeah, I did that. Not so honest on the tax return last year. Yeah, check. Could I be a little bit more generous? Could I be generous at all? Yes. Like, dabbler in sin, maybe. But slave of sin, that just seems a little bit steep. And Jesus says, no, come on. He's like, let your guard down. We're safe here. Remember, we took the standard, we put it on the floor, the door's open. Grace, look. We're safe here. We're good. He says, you know why you walk off the path? The reason you walk off the path is because you're walking along, and it's dark, and you can't see that well. You're walking along, and then there's acceptance out there. Like, you're like, is that acceptance and approval? Like, right, I think I see acceptance and approval over there. And you start walking, or you think, wait, Is that safety and control? I think through that thicket is safety and control. I'm going to walk over there because I think I see safety and control over there. Or, wait, freedom? Is freedom through there? Guys, I think I spotted freedom right through there. Right? I can't quite make it out, but I think it's this way. And we walk off the path. We don't walk off the path because we're evil people. We don't walk off the path to do bad things or evil things. It's something good. You walk off of it because you think that you found the way. People walking in the dark always think that they found the way. He's like, here's what happens. You take one step in that direction, and it just leads to another step. And that leads to another step, which leads to another. And consistently, little by little, one step makes the next step easier. Each step makes the next step a little bit easier. Each step makes the next step a little bit easier. And step by step, the steps build upon one another. And the result is that those steps that we take consistently, the steps that you take consistently, will take you somewhere eventually. That each step stacks up one on the other, and each step consistently will lead you somewhere eventually. And that eventually is where those steps become habits, and those steps just start to become routines. It's just those steps become the things that we just do reactively, the things that we just live by. And eventually those steps, we don't even have to think about them anymore. It's not even a choice anymore. It's just what we do now. It's just how we communicate. It's just how we relate. It's just how we talk about other people. It's just how we think about other people. It just becomes how we think about ourselves. It just becomes how we cope with stress. It just becomes how we do things. We don't even have to think about it anymore. And then eventually, those steps that we take consistently that lead us somewhere, eventually, it's hard to get back out of that place. Those desires that we built up little by little over time, it's hard to undesire those things. Those habits that we built up and reinforced little by each consistent step become really hard to undo. Those patterns, behaviors, they're hard to get ourselves back out of. Those steps, what we do consistently, we know this, don't we? They will master us eventually. That the further we walk down those shortcuts, eventually, those things get a hold of us. Those things that we did by free choice, that we chose freely and we did freely, somehow, in some way, along the way, those things get a hold of us. And we feel under the control of those things. And that habit of gossip, it's just hard to undo. That addiction that was our way of coping with stress, it's become that. It's become an addiction. That way of communicating, of expressing our anger and frustration in order to control and manipulate somebody else, it just becomes the way that we handle things. It just becomes what we do. And it becomes really, really hard to undo. It's like those things that we thought we needed, now we can't let go of them. It's like they've gotten a hold of us. What we do consistently, little by little, eventually, it masters us. It's hard to undesire. It's hard to break those habits. It's hard to pull back out of it. So Jesus says, well, everyone who sins, they're a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family. The slave has no permanent place in the family. The family of love that's walking down in Jesus' way of love and walking on the path, that family walk and the family of love, slave has no permanent place there. Not because they're not welcome there, not because they've lost their status, but because in that walk down the path, they have a master that's always calling them away. They have envy that's always calling them away. They have the voice of the addiction that's always calling them away. They have some master, something that's got a hold of them, a habit, a desire, something that always calls them away from the family of love, and they can't stay on the path. But the Son belongs to it forever. The Son always walks in the way of love. The Son has no master that calls him off of the path of love. He takes every single step in the way of love. Every single step that he takes is a step in the way of love. The Son belongs to it forever. And so, if the Son sets you free, if the Son who walks in the way of love, who invites you to follow him freely, the Son who doesn't force you, The son who doesn't threaten you, the son who doesn't try to bribe you or exert control over you or coerce you, the son who invites you freely to follow him. If the son sets you free, you're free indeed. If the son invites you to follow him, you become free indeed. The son says, come and follow me. Just one step. Start taking steps in this direction. We say, whoa, but Jesus, it's all uphill. He's like, I know, but just little steps, just one little step at a time. One little step. We're going to start walking back some of those thought habits. We're going to start walking back some of those communication patterns. We're going to start walking back some of those things that you just little step. Jesus, come on. I've skipped leg day for like 10 years. He's like, we'll build that back up. Don't worry. We'll build that musculature right back up. Just little step. We're going to start walking back some of those habits. We're going to start walking back some of those patterns. We're going to start walking back some of that way of relating. And I'm going to invite you to follow me and start walking after me. Little step by little step. Little by little. I'm going to teach you to see the way that I see. Little by little, I'm going to teach you how to have patience. I'm going to teach you, trust me. Little by little, I'm going to teach you how to have compassion for other people. Little step, one little step by little step, I'm going to teach you how to be generous. Trust me. Little step by little step, I'm going to teach you how to have grace and acceptance, to accept others the way that I've accepted you. I'm going to teach you how to deal with that bitterness. I'm going to teach you how to give forgiveness. Little step by little step. If you follow me consistently, it will ultimately set you free. Little step. Follow me, and it will set you free. Things that we do consistently, the little things, moment by moment, day by day, week by week, the habits, the patterns, the routines, leads us somewhere eventually. And Jesus is inviting us to follow him. When we follow him consistently, it will free us eventually. And I know, here's where we say, time out, because I see what just happened there. I love all your flowery language. It's nice and pretty, right? Walking like God's love path, sweet. But what you just did was just give us we give up our freedom in order to align with Jesus. We had to give up our walking off the path style of living, walking off the path desires in order to align with Jesus. So you didn't solve the tension right there. We're still trading faith for freedom. Same problem that's always been. And Jesus would say, no. And Jesus' first century followers would say, no. And Paul would say, no. Paul, who was persecuting followers of Jesus as a Pharisee until he met the resurrected Jesus. And Paul became a follower of Jesus and planted communities of followers of Jesus all over the Roman Empire. Paul never backed down from the freedom that Jesus offered. He always drove home and emphasized the freedom that we have as followers of Jesus, even to the point that his first century listeners thought that what Paul was advocating was that since God is happy with us, well, then let's just go for a sin it up, you only live once kind of life. What's it matter? If God's happy and we can't upset him and we have grace, all bets are off. Let's do whatever we want. And Paul's response to that, was not to back down from freedom. Paul never took his foot off the gas pedal of freedom. He just mashed it down even harder, even when people misunderstood. The way that Paul responded to that, if you're uncomfortable with the whole idea of freedom, then Paul is about to make you really uncomfortable. Because what Paul says to people who had understood what he was saying as a license to sin it up, here's how Paul responds. He says, I have the right to do anything. Paul, wait, Anything? Anything. Anything's a big umbrella. Anything. I mean, like, doesn't sin fall under the umbrella of anything? Anything. I have the right, the freedom as a follower of Jesus to do anything. But listen. Not everything is beneficial. Not everything is good for me. Not everything is for my best. I have the right to do anything. Paul, can you stop? There are children present. They're going to think that they can do whatever they want. Paul's like, no, I have the right to do anything. Complete freedom to do anything. But listen, I will not be mastered. I will not be mastered by anything. Paul's like, you know what keeps me on the path? I'm walking in the way of love, and I'm free to walk off the path. I'm free to walk this way. I'm free to go exploring this way. But you know what keeps me on the path? It's not fear. It's not shame. It's not bribery. It's not coercion. It's not threat. It's not fear of punishment. What keeps me on the path? Paul looked into the eyes of Jesus. Paul, who was putting followers of Jesus in prison and to death, looked into the eyes of Jesus and saw love and grace and acceptance. Paul says, you know what keeps me on the path? I'm convinced that the way of love, that Jesus' way of love is the way. It is the only way life can work, and is the way forward for me, for my best, for the best of others. That it is the way. And I don't walk off the path because I want to align up with my best for the best of others. I don't walk off the path because I trust Jesus' way of love is the only way forward for our world. I'm free to do whatever I want, but I'm always going to walk along the path. Because along the path, when I follow Jesus, when I follow consistently, it's what ultimately sets me free. Free to be who God created me to be. Free to experience life the way that God created me to experience it. What we do consistently will lead us somewhere eventually. What we do consistently will either lead us into slavery or it'll set us free. Jesus invites us to follow him in the little things, in the moment to moment, the day to day, the week to week, the month to month, and year to year living, because what we do consistently takes us somewhere eventually. It'll either be slavery or it'll set us free. And this is why our number 2 thing at Key City Church is holistic. We call it holistic personal disciplines. Holistic personal disciplines. And it's just a reference to just the things that we do day to day. The habits, the patterns, the routines that we set in our lives. Because a huge percentage of our lives just ties right back to the moment-to-moment, daily thought habits, thought patterns, how we communicate, how we relate, how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, the disciplines that we have in place, the disciplines that we don't have in place and should have in place. So many of the hiccups and problems and dead ends that we come to in life tie back to the disciplines, the routines, and the habits that we've established consistently that have gotten us somewhere eventually. And what we want to encourage as a community is regular reflection on, not fear-driven, shame-based, self-critiquing ourselves constantly to see how bad we are, but a grace-based, a love-driven reflection on what are the habits, what are the routines, what are the patterns that I've allowed to become established in my life that are holding me back and maybe have even gotten a hold of me. What are the things that are keeping me from my best for the best of others that I need to learn how to let go of? And what are the things that I need to put in place? What are the regular disciplines, the habits, the practices, the routines that I need to start little by little, step by step, putting into place? Because what we do consistently will lead us somewhere eventually. It's eventually going to lead us into slavery, into something that has a hold on us, and that thing that we did freely now has control over us, or it's going to set us free. And Jesus' desire, what Jesus came for, what Jesus ultimately wants, is to invite you to follow him, to trust him freely, so that you can be set free into who you are ultimately created and meant to be. Because you were, and I was, we were, all of us, meant to be free.